when taking responsibility, it isn't just jumping on the bandwagon and finding politicians who say the words that make you feel good about the opinion you already have. This is advanced citizenship. If you are going to be part of this system, you have to really try to understand these issues, to grapple with things. And if you can't understand them because they're so far beyond you, you need to figure out a way to vet the people that you're trusting. Which expert am I actually going to go, I think he's right about that. I think he's being honest, and I think he knows what he's talking about. These are decisions we're making. We're responsible ultimately. So we have to make really intelligent approaches to our stewardship of this system. And I think that what's happened to so many of us today is that we've fallen into these troughs of news media sort of confirmation bias, these echo chambers of just self-gratifying, yeah, we're right and they're wrong, they're terrible. It's through grappling with the tensions of things upon which reasonable people do disagree and trying to bring them together. And in so doing, they don't change, but we do. We open our minds open with the challenge of these difficult concepts.
And that tension, as you're pointing out here, is not the tension between polarized parties or followers of parties. The real tension is what's inside of us. And the minute you can withdraw the tension and the projection from your opponent and find both of those positions inside of yourself, you've done the thing that a good citizen should do.
Shepherd. This is the Converging Perspectives podcast.
This is from Alexis de Tocqueville, the classic Democracy in America, which is now over 200 years old. When de Tocqueville came and spent almost a year here in the United States, traveling around, conversing with Americans from every class and station. And one of his observations is that the cares of political life engross a most prominent place in the occupation of the citizens of the United States. And almost the only pleasure of which an American has any idea is to take part in the government, to discuss the part he has taken. Debating clubs are to a certain extent a substitute for theatrical entertainment. An American cannot converse, but he can discuss. And when he attempts to talk, he falls into dissertation. He speaks to you as if he was addressing a meeting. And if should chance to warm in the course of the discussion, he will infallibly say, "Gentlemen," to the person to whom he is conversing. This is just such a delightful observation from an outsider, from a Frenchman, coming into this young democracy, just filled with the fervor of what it means to be a citizen, where you have a role and a responsibility for the governing of the country.
I think it's really important that we recognize this as a real responsibility. It may seem like your one vote out of 100 million or so is irrelevant, and that your state always goes to this blue color or whatever. In a very real way, if we don't take responsibility as individuals, it perpetuates a culture where no one takes responsibility. And then before long, you realize that you're just asleep. Well, your government is basically raiding other countries and murdering people. And that's blood on your hands, morally speaking. And I don't think we can completely write that off. Say, oh, it's not my fault, not my responsibility. I didn't know anything about that. You are investing in the system that does all of those things. If you do not stand as a steward to that system, you are accomplice to the damage that it does to the world.
Or the domestic damage. A very good example of this was the huge push towards prohibition 100 years ago. The number of Americans who got involved in politics for the first time, either directly or indirectly, as many of the women did, pressuring their husbands to vote against the drink of evil and for prohibition. The women were incredibly active in this. And men were impressed with the zeal and the fervor that the Temperance Union and other groups were able to stir up in the general populace. But this was a learning experience because we didn't recognize that for every bold political leap forward, there are unintended consequences. And the amount of damage and harm that prohibition did to all walks of life. I mean, the growth of that deep, dark underground that gave rise to all sorts of additional problems to the mafia was not something that had been foreseen, right? The kind of black and white idealistic thinking of the progressives failed to recognize that human nature was still going to assert itself in the public sphere. And those who really wanted a drink we're going to find a way to get it. Democracy is always a learning process. And sometimes we educate ourselves because of the bad results that we've gotten.
And I think this is really important also just to recognize that when taking responsibility, it isn't just jumping on the bandwagon, finding politicians who say the words that make you feel good about the opinion you already have. This is advanced citizenship. If you are going to be part of this system, you have to really try to understand these issues, to grapple with things. And if you can't understand them because they're so far beyond you, you need to figure out a way to vet the people that you're trusting. Which expert am I actually going to go, I think he's right about that. I think he's being honest and I think he knows what he's talking about. These are decisions we're making. We're responsible ultimately. So we have to make really intelligent approaches to our stewardship of this system. And I think that what's happened to so many of us today is that we've fallen into these troughs of news media sort of confirmation bias, these echo chambers of just self-gratifying, yeah, we're right and they're wrong, they're terrible. And that's where we find ourselves completely divided, completely at war with each other, because we're not actually having a conversation. We're just throwing mud at the other side. We're just dehumanizing the other. It's through grappling with the tensions of things upon which reasonable people do disagree and trying to bring them together. And in so doing, they don't change, but we do. We open our minds open with the challenge of these difficult concepts.
And that tension, as you're pointing out here, is not the tension between polarized parties or followers of parties. The real tension is what's inside of us. And the minute you can withdraw the tension and the projection from your opponent and find both of those positions inside of yourself, you've done the thing that a good citizen should do. And if I could do a little diversion here and talk about a very specific example of what that looked like for me as a liberal who has spent time in my ministry working in soup kitchens and among the homeless and whatnot. And I was very much in favor of rent control. I championed cities that had rent control. And during the years that I spent in California, there was a huge push for more rent control in the big cities. And initially, I was all for it. It's like, yeah, don't kick the poor people out. Where else could they afford to go? But I had, along the way, done a lot of reading in urban studies. People like Jane Jacobs, The Life and Death of the Great American Cities. And I actually was beginning to understand the life cycles of the urban environment and the idea that gentrification happens almost as an organic process in cities that survive for centuries. If there is no gentrification process, cities don't survive. You have to have the influx of the new blood, the artists who are willing to live in the cast-off industrial spaces, improve them, bring them up to living standard, have cafes and galleries open around them, bring in the fancier restaurants. Now the property values go up. It's a nicer climate, so more young people move in. This is the process. This is the organic way that cities renew themselves so they can go on living. Rent control, the inability for landlords to float up with these rising property values in order to bring in different kinds of people actually breaks. It's like putting a chokehold in the great pipeline of new life that's trying to get into the city. And so you have to take a much more holistic and, very importantly, a much longer view, right? You can't just look at the story of this individual and his or her family emergency this year. You have to say, are we trying to maintain a housing stock for generations in this city? And then you come up with a very different idea about how government should intervene in the marketplace to help make that possible. So as a liberal, I had to give up my inclination to jump on the bandwagon of the liberal story, which is the story of care, help, these people need us, government should step in and make their life better, and surprise myself and some of my liberal friends by saying, no, I'm not in favor of that measure in the new California bill. I don't think we should have that amount of rent control. There has to be a more engaged fluidity with the free market for the health of all of us in the long run.
Yeah, a balancing of those things.
But that's hard. It was pulling the tension of the opposites inside of myself and having to almost self-chastisement. Don't leap so quickly. Take another look, do a little more research, probe to the depths.
Similar, it's easy to criticize the boss of a company when you're the worker and you feel like, oh, everything the boss does is terrible, making my life harder. Why am I not getting paid more? Why is this and that? And until you actually have the job of the boss and you realize all the pressures they're under, there might still be some unfairness. But until you really have been the boss, you don't necessarily have perspective on what it takes and the difficulties that are challenging that other perspective.
And here's an opportunity to bring in the importance of emotion in beliefs, right? Because the boss and the workers have different beliefs and different roles to play, but they also have different requirements. You could say that they're maybe at different levels of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. So the workers' needs are not the same, and the emotional needs are not the same. This was a really important topic of conversation for Jane Addams, the Jane Addams of Hull House at the turn of the last century. She got very involved in the Pullman strike because George Pullman was perceived as this crusty old industrialist who was oppressing the workers. He'd built a little village for them. They could all live in housing, but he controlled the wages and the rent. He even built the theater for them and then decided what sort of entertainment they should enjoy. In other words, he was a spitting example of patriarchy in all of its good and bad. But he enjoyed the sense that he was helping these downtrodden immigrants find a better life in America. And he thought he deserved respect and even admiration. So when the workers went out on strike and harassed him and called him names, there was this horrible emotional feedback loop that caused Pullman to be even more outraged and indignant and rigid. And it was Jane Addams who pointed this out. She, in fact, compared the Pullman strike and the tension between George Pullman and the workers to Shakespeare's King Lear and the trouble he had with his daughters, who did not respect him. What he wanted desperately was their love, admiration, and respect. And when he didn't get it, of course, he was outraged and disowned them and flung off in a huff, right? So the emotional component of the political arena is a critical piece that we do not understand and we do not honor. Because if we did, we would be able to predict, I think, with greater accuracy, why people do what they do.
It's interesting right now that we've been going through these January 6th hearings to sort of document what Donald Trump and other people in his administration and the protesters did. How well orchestrated was this? Was it a coup? Was it just a protest that got out of hand? They did a poll and realized that basically none of the numbers have changed from public opinion on anything. Pretty much people believe that it was either a protest march that got out of hand, or they believe that it was a violent coup. And those people haven't changed their opinions. The more data that we give people doesn't really necessarily change their minds. It has a lot more to do with emotion and relationship when people actually do have a shift. Obviously, time will tell. People's overall storying of Donald Trump and January 6th will evolve. But currently, the partisan attempts to shift things have not had much of an impact.
Well, this is a really interesting example, and we should look at this and ask, what does this tell us about the political dynamics in a democracy? Because as far as we can tell, we have to remember that the January 6th committee was already committed to its storyline. So these hearings have all been an attempt to persuade the non-believers to believe our version of the story. So right away, you're starting off with a huge disadvantage.
Right.
But there is a small group of people who have radically changed since January 6th and today. And that's this very small group of Republicans, including Mitch McConnell and Kevin McCarthy, who in the 48 hours during and after January 6th were outraged by the attack on the Capitol and Donald Trump's inaction. And we've got all of their testimony, we've got their tweets, we've got their phone calls, we've got their videos. They have made a 180. So that is worth looking at, right? That's the only group that has changed the story that they're telling. So we need to ask, why did they change their story? Whereas the fervent Trumps have not changed their story and the radical left has not changed their story. In other words, we all saw what happened. This is not something behind closed doors or a veil. The entire thing was televised and we all sat there for 5 hours and watched it unfold. So why did those Republicans change the story they were telling? To me, that's the most interesting question.
From what I've heard, the leading theory is their base would not reelect them if they were too against Trump.
Exactly. Within a few weeks, they had all crawled back to Trump to, quote unquote, kiss his ring, because they realized that they needed that other storyline in order to maintain their identity. And this is really at the heart of part of our attempt to link motivation, behavior, and belief back to those cognitive frames of mind which are hardwired into human beings. Our story defines our identity, and that is one of the fundamental purposes of the ego, is to make sure you have an identity, you know what it is, and you know where you belong. So if you have to change your storyline to get your identity back, by God, you'll do it.
And Donald Trump is a line of demarcation for the tribes, right? If you're with Trump, you're in this tribe. If you're not with Trump, you're in the other tribe. It's like, it's created this stark line of contrast. And it's not because people actually go, oh, I believe everything Donald Trump does, or I hate everything Donald Trump does. It's not really that stark. It's just the symbol that shows you which tribe you're in. And so you don't have the luxury of having nuance. Liz Cheney, who's running those January 6th proceedings, she's out of a job because she picked the wrong side of the line for her conservative base.
But all of us have these sort of invisible lines in the sand. And if we push our story script too far, we fall outside the boundary. So gay people coming out are always afraid of where that line is with certain family members or loved ones or associations, because they don't know exactly where it's been drawn. You only know it when you've crossed it, and then it's too late. The same with religion. How liberal, how much doubt can you bring into your religious identity before you're not part of that religious group anymore? You're forced out because you doubted too much.
Right.
So I think this is really, really critical, because none of us wants to be in exile. That's a terrible fate. So we're always playing with the margins of our story, of our narrative. And there has to be some flexibility or you can't grow, right? So for a lot of people, coming out as being gay was a huge, big deal. But then the next inflection, which was gay marriage, turned out not to be a huge leap. That was a little fraction of an inch further in extending that circle, which surprised a lot of people that it wouldn't be a bigger hurdle or a more disruptive script change. But it wasn't. And so everybody was still included in that circle of belonging.
So this reminds me of these concepts of the pathfinder and the
Tradition bearer.
traditions, right?
You're referring to the Gail Sheehy bestseller from 25, 30 years ago, where she identified these social archetypes. And she called some people the tradition bearers, and we might call them the conservatives, the ones who recognize that their role in society is to uphold the norms and the traditions and the old rituals and ways of being. And that's beautiful and important. You need people who know what the norms are and can inform the next generation. But then there's also the group called the Pathfinders. They're the scouts who are sent out to the margins of society to trailblaze and find new ways of doing and being. And her point was both of these roles are critical to a healthy society. And even though they seem to be at odds with each other, even diametrically opposed, in fact, you can't do without either of those groups.
It would behoove us to find in our hearts the generosity to respect and even be curious about the perspectives of those whom we most emotionally disagree with.
Which is always easier said than done because it's effortful. And human beings really, frankly, don't like that much intellectual effort. The cognitive load is high. And frankly, we would rather simply repeat what has worked for us in the past and get our little reward, our little ding, our little gold star, whatever it is that we have come to rely on.
But I think it's like working a muscle. I think you get better at holding the tension the longer you practice that. We've gotten really flabby in American society today. I think that much is evidenced by the results. I think it's time that we started pumping iron again, trying to understand, okay, I'm listening, it hurts, but I'm listening.
Well, in a sense, we're being forced into that position. We've been pretty complacent for our 225 years since the revolution, which was the last time that we really had to face these kinds of momentous tensions and conflicts. But if we are, in fact, to believe what our journalists and political commentators are telling us, we are pretty close to the verge of a civil war here in this country, which is calling us back into the arena. So we're going to have to get our gear together to figure out how do we negotiate this when we can no longer rely on that unified story of we Americans, where it constantly is now breaking down into us and them. We haven't had an international conflict that allowed us to all get behind a shared vision, like the Second World War. That was the last time that we were really genuinely all aligned as a people. So I think we are in difficult straits, and whether we can rise to the challenge and embrace the necessity to argue without blame, shame, and name calling remains to be seen.
Well, I'm dedicated with this podcast and other actions in my life to trying to at least get there as quickly as possible. Whether we end up in a civil war anyway is not under our control. Whether we get to a civil war or not, the objective is going to still be to reconcile these ideological issues. It's going to be about dialogue. It's going to be about understanding each other. So let's get there as quickly as possible is my suggestion. Do you want to dive into Roger Scruton again, our focus from last week?
I thought that would be important because we had introduced a lot of his ideas in some depth. And one of his critical points in his book For Liberals, to try to understand and respect conservatism, was his observation that as a society, we only flourish when we honor both cooperation and competition. That we need both of those impulses to be freely entered into and explored. That if there is only cooperation, we lose the fighting edge and become vulnerable to outside marauders, right? We've lost our fighting spirit. We can't defend ourselves. But if we're only competitive, it will be so fierce that we'll actually tear our own little society apart with infighting. So there seems to be this subtle, conditioned, socially conditioned, and almost unconscious movement in the individual psyche between the decision to cooperate or the decision to compete. And we're always looking, we're sensing the health of the structure that's holding us as a society to make that decision of whether we should cooperate or compete. When our society feels very strong and robust, it's safer to compete and try to move our way up through the ranks within our society and get more of the goods for ourselves, because the society can withstand that internal competition. If we feel that things are very weak and likely to fall apart, we will instinctively cooperate in order to strengthen the tribe. That's Scruton's basic premise. But this idea of the tension between cooperating and competing made me think of another author who sort of has laid out this tension in a different way, a different analogy, which is, are we living life as a game with winners and losers? Is life a game? You either win or you lose, and you play the rounds and you ante up and take your wins and losses. The guy with the most toys at death is the winner, that kind of thing. Or are we living inside of a story which is an infinite game? Is there a storyline which is so much greater and longer than ourselves, an arc which extends beyond our death and before our birth, that we recognize we're a part of this extended story, that we can play, but in a spirit of cooperation? And the author that I'm thinking of right now, who had so many profound things to say about this analogy, is James Carse, who wrote Finite and Infinite Games in 1986, which I still consider to be one of the best books I've ever read. But he said very succinctly, a finite game is played for the purpose of winning. An infinite game is played for the purpose of continuing the play. You can feel how incredibly different these two goals are, right? So the competitive spirit that wants the finite game, what's the kitty? I want to get it for myself and be the winner and go home, versus the one who's saying, how can we keep the game in motion? How can we continue the play so that everybody has a chance to participate? It's a completely different mindset. And I think that analogy is a very useful one for looking at politics right now. You could say, in one sense, that the January 6th committee, the Republicans, right, Adam Kinzinger and Liz Cheney, have lost the finite game. They will not be the winners. They have lost. But they've transitioned to say, we're playing the infinite game. We're still 100% involved in play because we want to continue the play of democracy. That is of greater interest and value to us than winning in the short term. So they've shifted their idea of what story they're engaged in from the finite to the infinite game.
I feel like this has been the theme for me all week. The finite game is what I think everyone in America, liberals and conservatives, are feeling. They're just exhausted. They're tired. They want the game to be over. It's like we're all longing for the rapture, whether we're Christian evangelicals or not. And it's like, oh, I just want it to be over. And so liberals are like, oh, if Trump would only go to jail, this would be over. And of course, that's not true. And, people on the right are like, if we could only win back the White House, this would be over. No, that's not true. The game is ever ongoing. And I saw this wonderful cartoon that was so hilariously sarcastic. You have one person with a protest sign saying, "The end is near." And another guy behind him has a protest sign saying, "This will never end." He says to the first guy, he says, Your optimism disgusts me. You're like rooting for the end to happen. And you're like,
Yeah.
like, you are so damn optimistic. We are in hell already and it's going to last for eternity.
But this is fascinating because what you've invoked now is the sort of subterranean infrastructure of the story of the West. And by West, I'm differentiating between the Occident and the Orient in philosophical terms, right? When we have the start of Judaism, Christianity, Islam, and that religious tradition, which sees life not as the cycle of eternal return, but as a trajectory towards a perfect ending, you've suddenly got a whole different storyline. So remember the fervor of Christians around, first of all, very early, right? In the 100 years after the crucifixion, the true believers thought that Jesus was going to return, there was going to be a huge conflagration, and the world would end. They were absolutely convinced that that's what was going to happen. It didn't. So they bought into a longer game. But then at the year 1000, there was again that millennial fervor. Now, surely we're at game point and we're going to have the second coming, and finally we'll be divided, right? The sheep to the right and the goats to the left, and God will come to judge.
Right.
Same thing when the year 2000 approached. In other words, we've set ourselves up to expect there will be an ending. So at some profoundly deep psychic collective level, we've been stretching it out for so long that we are exhausted. How long has any series ever strung out the final episode and maintained the interest of viewers? There's, it's the limited capacity, no matter how many thrills and chills you put into any episode.
Well, and worse about this is just that the mindset around a finite game means that you can use up all of your resources, and it's fine because, well, we'll be done. We'll be done by the time we're out of resources. Like, no. What's interesting is that we as individuals, our lifetimes do seem to have a finite time limit, somewhere between 60 to 120 years, and we're done. But our progeny do not. The human species is part of this nonstop perpetuating life force that lasts for thousands and millions of years. And so we're playing this game as if it's my lifetime or just my grandchildren is the only ones I care about. And we're running up against that limit now, potentially with climate change issues. But we basically are thinking about this from a mindset of finiteness when really we need to be thinking about it from a mindset of the human species and its potential.
This is another aspect of the Western mythos of hyper-individualism, that the West gave birth to autobiography and the focus of the individual through the Renaissance and the Enlightenment, the dignity of every human being. So we are tending to see things in shorter cycles, the cycle of my lifetime. Whereas in the ancient traditions of the Far East, or what we, the so-called primal religions of Africa or indigenous populations, where you were always linked deeply to the ancestors and you understood your life as simply sort of the latest push of that long body of your tribe, your lineage into the next incarnation. But you were, the great sagas, for instance, always were the recounting of how far back you went in time and how the spirit of the ancestors was moving through you. So that myth of the eternal return, where everything is cyclical and there is no end, you're not looking for an end. There is no Armageddon. It's just we're back here again. And at the end of that cycle, Vishnu is going to wake up and look around and yawn, and all of the worlds will dissolve. And then he's going to yawn again and go back to sleep, and the lotus will open, and we'll have another eon of 234,000 years or whatever.
Right. So what you just described, though, is like these are ways to integrate our individual story or the finite game with the larger story, the infinite game. Like we don't have that integration going on in society today. We seem to have mostly just finite game, finite game, finite game. And then some people are like, oh, infinite game. But we don't have a process to put those mindsets together to get them to actually combine in a healthy way. And I think that's what you're saying about Roger Scruton. He was saying we need both the cooperation and the competition. We need to see how those things go together like a hand and glove. We need to see how the finite and infinite game goes together. I feel like there's so many isms. There's so many of these mindsets, or I like to think of them now as ideological frameworks that we seem to be beholden to, that we champion with deep devotion and zealousness. And yet we have not really examined their limits, where they no longer work anymore. And I'm thinking about scientism, which is sort of the extreme religification of science in the sense that everything is reducible to material causation, and all mythology was the old garbage that they used before they really understood things like we do today. Very problematic perspective, even scientists will tell you. Liberal utopianism, of course, which we've been talking about with the sort of the Star Trek vision of, as long as we are more logical and less emotional and more scientific, all problems will be solved through rationality. Like, that is actually a form of magical thinking. If you study the cognitive biases, you'll realize that. Then we've got like nationalism or isolationism, which is what's really led to World War II. We've got the sort of nostalgic bias going on with the MAGA movement today. Like, let's just get back to the way things were. That'll somehow work. We've got the workaholicism, a flow out of free market capitalism, which is another mindset or ideological framework that has shown it has limits, but we don't want to acknowledge that it does. We don't want to acknowledge that we're going into dangerous sort of demonic places with this ideology that is sacred to us and unquestionable. And then there's the libertarians, who I like to say are 90% correct, but that other 10% could kill us all. And we see with the liberals and the conservatives today, there seems to be this adherence to, again, these mindsets that are highly conflictual. The liberals are all about this globalist mindset of we are all one. We all have to work together. A world government would be a good thing. And on the conservative side, it's like, world government is this horrible freedom robbing dystopian future that we must avoid at all costs. We must tribe together in our small, insular, little cultural groups that protect us from that encroachment upon our freedoms.
You know what strikes me about all of the isms that you've just named and described is that the common source of the isms seems to be what I would call the great human push to control the environment, in contradiction to the age-old formula, which was, how do I fit into the environment, right? So you have the ancient hunter-gatherer nomadic approach to life, which was, if I observe closely enough what's happening here, I will know how many children I can bring into the family, how often I'll have to move, how much I can take at any one time from this herd or this group of berry bushes before we have to move on. So the calculation always put us in the receptive position of working with what was there. Now things have changed utterly in that we begin with the assumption, I can control this. I can change the environment. I can force the environment to serve me and the needs that I have. I do not have to change myself. Everything else around me will change. And there are multiple versions of how to use that human control to change the environment. But all of them stem from that belief system that we can control it. And so to me, that is very suggestive of the current state of panic and distress, because we may have reached the limits of that mindset, of that storyline of humans control everything, can control everything, should control everything.
Right. Well, this very much reminds me of narcissism, the psychological concept of narcissism, which a lot of psychologists say today is sort of the real epidemic of our times. That Americans, there's this huge explosion of narcissism. Not that we're all being diagnosed with a personality disorder, but that the same tendencies at a mild level of narcissism, which is to basically create a delusional reality that protects our ego, that protects our self-esteem from any kind of damage. It's basically when you have helicopter parents that basically protect their children from any kind of adversity, well, then they're super sensitive, right, to any kind of criticism. They can't take it. So our sensitive, wounded egos create this delusional shield of a false reality to protect us from reality. And that perpetuates this try to change everything outside of us because we're perfect. I'm perfect. I have nothing I need to change. Nothing that needs to change within me. The world needs to change to fit me. And of course,
Right.
that doesn't work when you have more than one narcissist in the room.
Or when you have one narcissist versus nature. I mean, let's be frank, that's what it's really about. And I think that's a very interesting leap that you made to the psychological problem that is, again, an unintended consequence of industrialization and the Enlightenment and hyper-individualism. That we now believe that we're all little gods who can control the universe and each other. And our frustration when we cannot is really making us sick, literally making us sick. So here's another quote from Joseph Kars from Finite and Infinite Games. He notes that only that which can change can continue. This is the principle by which infinite players live. What you've just highlighted in your comment, I will not change. I will force others around me to change. I will not change. I will force the environment to change. I will not change. I will force the political opponents to change. All of that is predicated upon this idea that somehow change is bad and suggests something blameworthy. But what Kars is saying is that if you identify with the infinite game, you realize immediately that to be in a state of no change is the death knell.
Yeah.
The static boredom of that is just inconceivable. To play the infinite game, you are committed to eternal change and must develop that quality, that capability and flexibility at the deepest psychological level.
Yeah. And I think I feel it in the way people complain about the right or the left, this sort of just despondent, like, oh, I don't want to deal with anyone. I'd like to just kick them all out of the country, or let's just execute them all. Just get rid of those people. They should be ridden from the face of the earth because they're so stupid. It's this longing for the game to be over. It is ultimately an existential angst, longing for death, because we're tired of being alive. We're tired of the difficulty and tension of being alive. And that suggests a very sick.
It's only difficult and stressful because we think we ought to be able to solve it or fix it or end it. That's an arbitrary viewpoint. I think that's what I've been trying to point out, that we're stressing ourselves to no purpose because this is not a finite game, ultimately. And to try to pretend that it is putting artificial boundaries and constraints on what is really an infinite game. So you can't force life to play a finite game with you.
Absolutely.
So we are the ones that have to adapt and change. Right. We have to find the mindset that allows us to let go of the illusion of control and domination without losing completely our egoic center. We need some identity as a vehicle to move around in life. So we need to work out a way to do that more gracefully so that we are the ones to adapt and be in a state of flux to accept what is coming up. And in fact, if you look at, quote, the long stories of liberals and conservatives, those storylines have gone through a lot of script editing in ways that you would never have predicted 100 years ago. And I know that other people have noted that. The conservatives of 150 years ago would not recognize the conservatives of today because the values have in fact shifted profoundly on both quote unquote political sides. So this is, sort of a quandary, a conundrum, a paradox that might be worth looking at, if only to reassure ourselves that change is always happening anyway. So we might as well look at it and accept that reality.
And then have some, measure of directional control, try to help nurture, nudge the system along in a way that we deem, from our greatest sense of wisdom, most beneficial to all. I stumbled across a video by Weinstein on Big Think. It was called The Social Brain. And he goes through a synopsis of what's going on in the world, pretty similar to what we presented last week. Basically, that culture is sort of the software of the Homo sapien. It is downstream of biology. So biology we have to respect, or else we are doing this sort of narcissistic, delusional game with ourselves. But beliefs can literally be false, yet metaphorically true. And that's where sort of religion and mythology comes in, is that when we believe in something that we can't prove, but that belief helps us do a more survival thing, like care for our neighbors, grow our circle a little larger sense of self is the reason why we've been able to have large societies. And he says that these cultures are able to program our minds to be at odds at times with our own survival, which is the danger. And perhaps that's where we've come to, is where the cultural scaffoldings of religion and education have somehow lost their wisdom anchor or center point. And to some degree, we've groomed ourselves to be anti-survival in our current culture. Think about the climate change as the most obvious thing. We are polluting our air and our own water, killing off animals, over farming, depleting soil. We're doing all sorts of things that are actually making it look like we're going to kill ourselves in the next couple decades just by trying to survive. This mindset we've developed of like this finite game is possibly going to kill us in the infinite game.
Another wrinkle to that is that the kinds of societies that we've nurtured in our huge agricultural and industrial method have allowed us to create castes and classes that are so elevated that they are simply absorbing tremendous amounts of resources, way beyond what would have been a normal and healthy amount for any individual Homo sapien on the planet. The amount of fossil fuels that you and I have consumed in our light bulbs and our laptops and our vehicles over the courses of our lives represent thousands of individuals who would have lived 500 years ago. The rate at which we are using up things has accelerated to such an extent.
Right. And we've normalized it.
It's become normalized. And so once you're at that level, you can't give up those goods, services, and resources because your loss of stature would be so horrifying for your ego protection, right? That everything in you would fight against the loss of status.
So we're like a frog being boiled in the pot. We're like, what's different? Why should I get out of the pot? This is totally normal. But the resources, when they are beginning to run low, and we're beginning to see that they are, it is going to cause our natural tribal fear reaction, which will shrink our in-groups and turn us into these tribal warriors again. And that is what happened in Nazi Germany. That is what happens in lots of places when the resources begin to dry up and you have bloodbaths as the result.
We are right at the cusp of finding out how do very mature, highly civilized Homo sapiens deal with the sudden loss of the creature comforts they have been enculturated into.
So Brett Weinstein also just talks about the need for moral restraint to a free market. We think, oh, free market's great. Well, yeah, up until a point, and then it's creating a lot of these problems we're talking about. He says we need a new paradigm in order to create a functional society again. I suspect he would agree that it needs to be created through some form of cultural scaffolding, like religion, but maybe not religion, some kind of educational system that helps us get into a better mindset necessary for dealing with the problems that we're currently dealing with. He's very critical of utopians, of utopian realities, because he sees them as sort of the basis of most of our horrible conflict in the last century. Utopia is a magical thinking. It's a form of magical thinking.
It's also a finite game. All utopias spend a lot of time and effort, right, creating the game plan, the rules, the boundaries. But then you try to create an actual storyline inside a utopia, there's nothing there. Without conflict and change, there is no story. Right. So utopias are also end game, in a sense, Armageddons, right? But ones that end in this blissful paradise picture rather than a Hieronymus Bosch. But they're both finite games. And that's really important to notice. Right. It's interesting that both Weinstein, who is a self-styled liberal, and Scruton, who's a self-styled conservative, agree that culture is downstream of biology. This is very interesting and worth noting. That in fact, if we're looking at our big group story, almost all of us have decided to bow to Darwin in some respect. We are now willing to accept that we have arisen and emerged out of the general creature life of the planet, that we haven't been placed here from some divine alien force as other than the other species. And I think this is really interesting because that would be a big change. That would be a change to our story.
And this is really important to point out too, is that this may be at the crux of the liberal and conservative split as well, because some psychological research has been done to suggest that conservatives biologically have a slightly more cagey around controlling their environment, and that liberals tend to be a little bit more like, oh, I'm open to whatever happens here. There's a more happy-go-lucky attitude, and they can detect this in common in the brain waves, that you can look at brain waves and actually predict with, I think, 70% accuracy whether someone's going to be conservative or a liberal.
Just based on sort of their hyper-awareness of possible threat level.
Yeah, it's basically threat detection sensitivity, or fear sensitivity. Yeah. And so you could say that the peace and love globalism perspective is coming from a largely fearless mindset that may be naive to some degree, but it is somewhat biologically driven, this openness to the world. And I'm not afraid of a world government, destroying us all. Like that's unlikely to happen if we're involved with it. And then you've got the conservative mindsets, like, I don't trust those people. I don't trust any bigger group of government, institution. That makes me nervous. It's coming from a biological level. And if we don't acknowledge that, then I'm not sure we can actually intellectualize our way out of it.
No, that's a really good point. And it takes us back to the tradition bearers and the pathfinders, specifically the pathfinders in this instance, that for the health of a tribe, it's really good to have some people who are not afraid to just sort of plow off into the savannah or duck out from behind the tree and see what's going on. Right? Because they're capable of that. They will be more in danger, but it's for the good of the tribe that the pathfinders take on the risk for the tribe in that sense.
And not necessarily the whole tribe put their head in the way of the new threat.
Yeah, I was thinking about that. In fact, just today, I was once again called upon my cat to go and open the door for her. And in the past, I've always thought of it, oh, well, she's just, being Princess Kitty. Someone open the door for me. She has a cat door. She can easily go in and out herself. But no, she'll sit there and meow until a human being comes and opens the door for her. And I suddenly thought, wait a minute, I've been framing this all wrong. But, anthropomorphizing that she wants someone to wait on her. No, this is a strategic, adaptive solution. If I meow, I'll get another creature to go out that door before me. And then if there's something like a nasty raccoon or a snake or a hawk, they're going to get it. I won't. I'm standing here in the doorway waiting to see if the coast is clear. I thought, well, of course. Why wouldn't the cat take advantage of my kindness in order to preserve her life and safety? That makes perfect sense. So in this sense, my cat Clarissa is the conservative and I'm the liberal. Sure, I'll open the door and poke my head out.
There you go. So Brett Weinstein says something interesting. He says that Our founders of our country knew nothing about evolution. They predate evolutionary theory.
That's right.
And therefore, the laws and the culture that we've set up does not take into account what we now know about biology. So basically, our culture is now reinforcing some of our worst nature rather than restraining it. And this has led to laws that basically continue to perpetuate problems. And it has led to markets that have adapted evolutionarily to manipulate the government, which is why our government is no longer really for the people. It seems to have been more or less usurped by corporate interests.
Well, of course, this is a really profound observation, because as you and I have just noted, the acceptance of our biological origins is a significant change to the long storyline of Homo sapiens on the planet. So a system that has been imposed upon us that does not take that into consideration is by very definition insufficient to meet the needs of the times. And I think if we're looking at sort of the biologically driven motivations and the theories of emotion and motivation that are now current, right, in evolutionary biology and evolutionary psychology, we have a lot that needs to be changed and shifted in our constitution, in our laws, in the way we've set up our societies to deal with some of these big problems. For instance, the global problems. We are very bad at dealing with global problems because everything that we've set up in our society assumes a nationalism. It assumes a smaller group dedicated to its own self-interest. Global problems like global warming have to be able to get out of that mindset. You have to be able to relinquish nationalism and perceive yourself as an earthling. This is a huge leap forward, but one that would be possible if you go into our biological destiny as emanations of planet Earth, which is before the nation that you are currently living under. So I think this is a really important observation.
Well, we could bring up right now just the fact that Brett Weinstein is a self-acknowledged liberal. We used to be a professor at one of the most liberal universities in the country until he got fired.
He wasn't fired, but he was part of the campus riots that took place in the very liberal atmosphere of Minority Day, where in this campus, the tradition was that all of the minorities would stay off campus for a day in order to help elevate the recognition of how much minorities have contributed. And if they suddenly weren't there, you would recognize what was missing and you would come to appreciate them more. It was an interesting strategy. But this one year, the suggestion came down that actually all of the white people should leave campus and let the minorities take over campus that day. And Brett Weinstein took exception to this. He said, this is not the same thing at all. To exclude us and tell us to leave is exactly the opposite of what you're trying to accomplish, at least what you said you're trying to accomplish, which is to sort of uplift our sense of appreciation of inclusivity and unity. This is having the opposite effect. You're telling us, get lost. I'm not going to leave campus. He was actually attacked in his classroom. And the riot got so bad, the campus police told him, you must leave because we can no longer ensure your bodily safety in this classroom. He did leave, but it was such a scandal that the university couldn't physically protect its own faculty from students who had gotten out of hand in their rioting and harassment. And Weinstein and his wife sued the university and left. They were not fired. They left. And the university had to pay them quite a large sum of money to settle this law case. Like Jordan Peterson, he was someone who came to see the dark side of the so-called liberal progressive movement that was undermining the values that it sought to achieve.
I think this is an example, again, of just a lack of understanding of biology and psychology. If people on the left understood what they're really dealing with, that culture is downstream of biology, There are certain lines they wouldn't cross because it doesn't make sense. It's not going to help you. Burning down all those buildings in your city is not going to help Black Lives Matter. It's not. You know,
Right.
it
But-
may
but
feel
again,
good in the moment, but it's not going to solve the problem. And
Right. But this is something that radicals never take into consideration, right? This was just Scruton's point, that he became a conservative when he saw the Paris riots of 68, I think, or 72.
yeah,
When he saw people just wantonly destroying beautiful buildings and art and artifacts. It's like, what are you doing? This is one of the great cities on the planet. This is the height of culture, and you are indiscriminately going to tear it all down. How is that going to help you moving forward?
yeah.
Right. So that's the complete lack of pulling in the tradition bearer energy to your own psyche. So in a university setting, the university is dedicated to being the carriers of tradition. That is its primary function, is to bestow the wisdom of the generations to the next generation and provide a forum for them to accept it, embrace it, and expand upon it, thereby enriching society. That's the purpose. So if you have a university that is trying to shut down the movement of intelligence, experience, experimentation from the one generation to the next, you've completely defiled the purpose of the university.
I think that the radical movements on both the right and the left, they need a place to vent. Like they need the place to get all their emotions out so that they can reclaim their rationality again and actually rejoin the conversation with the rest of the people in the middle.
But I mean, that's a tall order. What you're saying now is that young people need to be able to recognize, articulate, and control their emotions. Biologically, we know that's really a tough call and not very likely to happen, historically speaking.
Yeah, but what we've created culturally with the news media and with our politics and with our education to some degree too is basically a recipe for more explosiveness, more dysregulation emotionally, more madness. Because money is being made on this system, it will not stop. No one will morally say, hey, I got to turn this off because I'm hurting people. Like, no, I got to keep it going because other people are pushing me to make them more money.
Well, now you're talking about markets as finite games. All capitalist corporations and markets are finite games. They're in it for the very short term. They're in it for the profit for this quarter and next quarter and the annual report. They will not take the long range view. That's totally an antithesis to what they are set up to do.
Well, strangely enough, of course, you've got corporations that are not really people, but they can outlive people by many generations, theoretically, and they don't want to ever stop growing as a business. It's a fixed mindset on growth, ironically.
You know, Andrew, there are very few corporations that have actually lived for more than 150 years. I read an article about this once. There are only a handful that have survived for hundreds of years, and they are all in Asia. They're Chinese or Japanese corporations that are family owned. So there's not outside investors. These are family businesses that have passed down from one generation to the next. And you can find some corporations, family corporations, that are 300-400 years old. But other corporations have a known lifespan, and they all die, like elephants or sea turtles. Yeah, they live longer than individuals in many cases, but not forever. And I think this is very important to note. Even religions have lifespans.
The Vatican seemingly breaking that that mold in a way. It's
Well, no,
Catholic
there have
Church has been
religions
around for
that lasted.
1700 years.
Yeah. And that's fine too. Religions can last as long as cities, right? Like Rome. Cities have some of the longest lifespans of any entities than anything on the planet because they have found ways to be open systems, to continually bring in new blood, new ideas, new resources, and have found ways to move through those dangerous periods. Nations don't last as long as cities. interestingly enough. Nations are much more volatile and short-lived. So we've covered a lot of ground in this conversation, Andrew, and we haven't come to any radical conclusions, although I think in summary, we could say that the insight that our long story has changed fundamentally in the acceptance of our evolutionary biology, and that we need to begin to incorporate that into our storyline and into our institutions going forward. We've also really sort of probed this idea of cooperation versus competition, which is part of our evolutionary strategy for survival as tribes and as larger groups. And we've played with this idea of storylines that are too short, that stop with the lifespan of an individual, versus the ongoing storyline of the long body of a people's, and the game theory of life. All of life is a game, but if you play it to win as a finite game, you're actually moving into Thanatos, the death wish, because you've pitted yourself against all of these short-term goals and you simply can't sustain that for too long. You become exhausted. And then you make unwise choices to try to bring the game to an end because you're just tired of it. Versus what Karst calls the infinite game, whose purpose is simply to continue the play. And here's a final quote from Karst, which I think really summarizes elegantly a lot of what we've been saying. He said, storytellers do not convert their listeners. They do not move them into the territory of a superior truth. Ignoring the issue of truth and falsehood altogether, storytellers offer vision. Storytelling is therefore not combative. It does not succeed or fail. A story is not to be obeyed. Instead of placing one body of knowledge against another, storytellers invite us to return from knowledge to thinking, from a bounded way of looking to a horizontal way of seeing. And that, I think, is what we're trying to do. We're trying to get away from the combativeness of let my story persuade and convert you and dominate you and control you, to allow my storytelling to open up the field of vision, to invite you in to a bigger conversation so that we're all staying in the game.